Hi and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. Javeria Salman is a digital news producer at the Hechinger Report, which covers innovation and inequality in education. Her beat, the future of learning in kindergarten through 12th grade, and her work is most often seen in a newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks. She's based in New York City. Javeria, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I'm excited to be here.
So the very first question is probably the easiest one of these. What's your journalism origin story?
Okay, so that one kind of goes back a little bit. I moved to the United States when I was 7 years old.
From
Pakistan. And we had been around a little bit in the Middle East as well. I grew up a little bit in Kuwait and spent some time in Qatar as well. Muscat. And so I was in some of those places. And when I moved to the US, one of the only ways, even at 7 years old, one of the only ways my family connected with news overseas or found out about what was going on in Pakistan and stuff, my dad was always reading online Urdu newspapers because that was his way of finding out news. And when I moved here, one of the ways that I sort of learned how to speak English was I just loved learning new things. And I used to just find newspapers very interesting. I have memories of my grandmother's always reading newspapers in Pakistan. And so when I came here, that was one of the fascinating things. I just love newspapers. And so I think that was sort of my journalism origin story. I learned how to read and learn about America through newspapers. And so.
That's awesome. I've started reading the newspaper when I was 6, so I can relate to what you're talking about. Was there something in your upbringing that would have lent itself to either telling stories or to education reporting?
So education reporting, I kind of fell into after college graduation, but telling stories, I think my grandfather, both my great grandfather and my grandfather were both sort of storytellers, and both on my dad's side and my mom's side. And my grandfather used to love traveling, and I never got to meet either of my grandfathers. They both passed away before I was born. But the stories that I heard from my grandmothers about who they were, and my great grandfather's notebook filled with different stories, I think maybe that's where I get some of my love for writing and traveling, especially news, because like I mentioned, both my grandmothers used to love reading newspapers. And then I think, and maybe it's also a part of living in so many different places, we moved around. After we moved to America, we moved around every 2 years. So every 2 years we would move to a different city because of my dad's job. And so even just coming to America, I'd already lived in 3 other countries. So I think maybe just the traveling and meeting new people, I just love telling stories and finding new stories to tell, and sort of, especially being from a marginalized community, wanting to share stories of my people and my community with other people that you didn't normally see in TV or news.
Was there an instance maybe early in your childhood or as you were growing up where you were maybe able to potentially diffuse something with someone related to the ability to tell a story about your upbringing?
Yeah, I think after 9/11, I do remember, I think that I was in California. I think I was in 4th or 5th grade when 9/11 happened. So it was quite early. But being, I think, especially, a Muslim girl that was going to school, and it was in a pretty liberal area. We were in California, in Southern California, but I do remember instances of racism even at that time and immediately afterwards. And one of the ways I specifically remember talking to people well, that's not what Islam says. That's not what our religion teaches us. And I think being able to connect with people and having lived in so many different places, and the way that my parents had always brought us up was, Islam is sort of, our religion is sort of like a powerful, way to express ourselves. And it gives us the ability to talk to people and share the beauty of our religion. And so I always was very passionate about both my religion and telling stories accurately and conveying that to people. And I think especially after 9/11, it allowed me to really like sort of conquer that fear and kind of be strong enough to learn about my religion and what it says, and then being able to convey that to people and tell them in a way that they would understand, and not just like, hey, no, this is not what it is, but actually like sort of empathetically like, okay, I understand that you might have some misconceptions. This is what it really says and what we really believe.
Now, you went to college in the South. You went to East Carolina University, so that must have been an interesting experience. And your journalism career, from as far as I can tell, is largely from there to Hechinger. What was your college media experience like?
Yeah, so I wasn't planning on going to college in the South. I did community college in in New Jersey, and my family ended up moving to North Carolina, and I was really against. I was like, nope, not going to CU, but I kind of just ended up there, and I had taken some time off, and I remember when I started at ECU, it was already it was right before Trump's presidency, and it was very interesting time to be in North Carolina, and it was my first time being exposed to. I had faced racism and different forms of discrimination growing up, but I don't think I experienced it as viscerally as I did in North Carolina. Right after we moved, right before I started actually college, and I had taken a semester off, and we had an incident happen in our house where somebody, broke our mailbox and wrote, "F you terrorist," and threw it through our car window. And that was sort of like a wake up call. It was like, oh, wait a minute, we're not, in New Jersey or California or Michigan anymore. We're in, North Carolina. And so I think when I started ECU and the first week of my college experience, I kind of found out about the newspaper tryouts, and I didn't know that ECU had a newspaper. And I remember going and trying out and getting accepted. And that was sort of just immediately, it was like, in that entire place, it was like, okay, I finally found like a little small, tiny piece of home that could feel comfortable. And I had always just been so passionate about journalism all throughout my high school career, sort of had been involved with a newspaper, and was very excited to finally, work as like a, college journalist. And we were treated sort of like our newspaper was an independent college newspaper, and our city newspaper, the one in Greenville, North Carolina, was fairly small, didn't have a lot of reporters. And so we didn't just cover the school, but we ended up covering a lot of the town itself. And I think my college experience was sort of my journalism experience at the university. But most of my time was spent in our newsroom was located downtown in downtown Greenville, and this little small building across from the courthouse. And we spent pretty much every day, all day there. And I think a lot of my sort of what I learned and how to be a journalist and what it takes, especially in the South, that I kind of learned from there and dealing with the community there.
Now, I read your farewell article. You talked about pushing through fear. And I imagine that some of that relates to dealing with the people within the community. But I'm curious, what about journalism fear and kind of elevating and ascending as a journalist?
Yeah, I think I know which article you're talking about. I remember I wrote that article as I was leaving ECU. And I think one of the things especially I learned about overcoming fear within just being a journalist and being a student at that time, when I had just been a reporter for a semester at East Carolinian, and my second semester, our managing editor approached me and asked me if I'd be willing to take on being the news editor that summer. And I was just like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. Like, this is such a big responsibility. And I was older than most of the students there because I had taken a year or two off, and I was coming back so I was older than most of my peers. And so maybe that was one of the reasons why they thought I could take that responsibility. But I felt so new to just being a reporter. I was like, hey, I've only been covering news in the city as a sort of, I guess you could say, professional journalist for only a semester. And now I'm being thrown into this sort of editor position. But my editor was just like, if you say no right now, then you're always going to wonder what if, like we think you can do this. You should just step up and, hey, it's the summer. There's going to be less stories. There's going to be less pressure, kind of just see how it goes. I was like, okay, I'll do it. And that summer sort of changed the entire course of ECU for me. And being a journalist, it like solidified what I wanted to do and why I wanted to do this, because I got a chance to explore so many different stories. I wasn't just covering news, but I was helping the arts editor cover stories. I was helping sports editors cover stories. And it was just such a cool experience of just like really learning the ins and outs of what it takes to put a paper together. Like we spent a lot of nights that summer designing the layout for the newspaper and what a print production looks like. And okay, now we were also experimenting at that time with, putting together our online edition and making it look nice online and all of those things. And so really solidified for me that. And then I think the other thing, when I was talking about fear, my senior year of college, when I was covering ECU, it was during the 2016 election. And we had several presidential candidates visit ECU at the time. I think maybe because it was of the location in North Carolina where we were, we used to get a lot of candidates, and former President Donald Trump, he made several visits to our community, and his last rally prior to the election was actually in ECU. And I remember, calling up my parents and I'm like, well, I am the news editor. I have to go. I'm taking a team of reporters and going. And I was the only, my photo editor and I were the only two students of color that were going to cover this event. And I was nervous, but I was a little scared as well, I'll be honest. And I think it was because I'd had some experiences covering, very rural conservative communities, having been at ECU for about 2.5 years at that point. But that was sort of like, can I actually do this? Like, what does it take? Like, what's going to happen? And then I was constantly getting phone calls from my parents, are like, maybe you shouldn't go. You're going to be the only one. And we've known obviously we'd heard reports at that time of like what was happening at some of the other rallies in North Carolina. And so I was a little scared, but I remember speaking with my advisor and my mentor at the newspaper, and both of them were like, it'll be an experience for you, but we're not going to tell you we're not going to tell you you have to go. But if something, in journalism, you're going to times where it's going to be uncomfortable and it's going to be hard. But that's kind of what, we do. And I was like, yeah, and I do want to be there. I want them to see a Muslim woman journalist and, covering the story objectively and reporting on it, that I'm not scared to be in this space. And I think that was a really unique experience. Because I don't only wear the hijab, I also wear the burqa, the abaya, the long dress. And so I immediately stand out, not just because of the hijab, but also because of the way I dress. And I do remember walking into that rally, into the media pit, and it was a very, very interesting experience. I got my picture taken from people who were like, oh my God, there's one of them, there's a Muslim. And so that was the sort of, I was just like, this is so interesting, but just, keeping a straight face and sort of not responding to those. And I think that was, those are some of the moments where it's like, yeah, I'm scared, but I'm going to do this because I love this job.
That's great that you were able to power through it. So let's go from there to your current job, which is at the Hechinger Report. Explain what the Hechinger Report is and what your role is with them.
Sure. So the Hechinger Report, we're a nonprofit news outlet based out of New York City. We cover education. So we're a one subject sort of newsroom. We cover national education issues, education policy, and our focus has always been covering inequality in education and innovation in education. And so we, tend to do a lot. We have a lot of investigative work, but we also do, we don't cover breaking news, even if it's education related. We tend to do more long form journalism. And so sometimes our stories, we can spend 6 months to a year reporting a story. And other times, reporters like myself, who are newsletter writers, we do bi-weekly newsletters. And so I cover the future of learning, which is basically the intersection of education at the intersection of technology and innovation. And so that's sort of my beat.
It's such a cool beat to be able to cover. Just looking at some of the things that you've done recently, you wrote about a dance teacher who created a program to educate Black girls about Black women in history. You wrote about the idea of blurring the last 2 years of high school and the first 2 years of college to create a more direct line to well-paying jobs. And you wrote about how the city of Oakland, California bridged the digital divide by getting computers and access to internet to as many students as possible. What characterizes the kinds of stories that you write about?
I think the best way to describe it is when I took over the Future of Learning newsletter, both my predecessors had done such an amazing job of sort of what they wanted to cover in the future of learning. And I think the future of learning, especially when I took over right as COVID started in the first couple of months of COVID. And, at that point, everything sort of was like, we're trying everything new. Education is constantly changing. And when I took it over, I wanted to be able to cover what the future of education looks like, but through a lens of covering it from communities that often don't get as much coverage, and students that are underserved in those communities. And so I wanted to tell stories about Black and Brown students and Indigenous students and rural students and even urban students, stories of students like myself that I, sometimes found hard to, stories about students like me and some of the struggles that I went through as a, English learner student in the US and an immigrant student in the US and a student that maybe, was underserved. And so I wanted to tell stories that people could connect to and find interesting, and just how education was changing to serve those students.
You mentioned kind of what we would essentially describe as your empathy. How has your empathy, is there a story on which your empathy in understanding a situation played a good role?
Yeah, trying to think. I early on during COVID, I reported on a story of a Latino mother who started a program in Las Vegas. She had a Facebook group that she was constantly talking to with other parents in the district who maybe didn't speak English, and their students or their kids didn't have devices at that time. They didn't have laptops. It was right at the start of COVID. And so one of my coworkers had happened to talk to this mother while he was on a reporting trip. And he was like, Javeria, I think this might be a story worth telling, especially because it falls into very much the future of learning beat. And so I reached out to her, and I remember speaking with her, and just so much of what she was telling me of like, we're going through this crisis, but these parents don't speak English, or these parents are completely new to this community or to this country and don't know where to go to get these resources, and the schools are closed, and the schools are already dealing with so much that they are maybe missing parents that they could reach out to. I remember speaking to her and just thinking about my own parents, and I was, I'm a first generation student here, and my parents and the struggles that they went through, and how I sort of had to learn everything on my own, or reach out to friends, parents who kind of grew up here to know what was going on in the education system. And so I think sometimes telling those stories, I'm able to understand some of the struggles that parents and low-income parents, parents who are immigrants, students that are immigrants, what they're going through, because I went through that. I went through that same process and some of those same struggles. And so I feel like I can understand their struggles where they're coming from when I'm reporting those stories. And I think it also gives me a perspective that maybe other journalists who didn't grow up in that same sort of experience that I did, I get a different window into that education reporting world.
You mentioned a colleague helping you with a story idea there, but how do you come up with most of your story ideas?
Most of my story ideas, I tend to workshop with our Hechinger is fairly small staff, and so we tend to workshop a lot of story ideas together. And so oftentimes, I'll be speaking to various coworkers, and we, during our budget meetings, will sort of throw ideas back and forth and come up that way. And other times I tend to keep up, especially with the future of learning. It's just a specific beat. I subscribe to a lot of newsletters, industry newsletters, and industry, kind of keep up with tabs on what's going on in the future of learning sort of beat. And if there's something that comes across that seems like, oh, this could potentially be interesting, even if it's very small at the time, if it's a small program or a small, like, sort of, sometimes, I'll read a report that a news organization, or sorry, a foundation or nonprofit released, and there'll be some interesting data point in there that I can pull out and be like, this is worth looking into and kind of paying attention to. And I try to talk to a lot of educators and kind of keep up with some of the different trends and what's happening in the future of, in the education innovation world.
You mentioned that you've kind of fell into the beat. One thing to just take a step back on
Yeah.
is, how did you get the job?
So after graduation, after I graduated college, there was about 8 to 9 months where I was submitting like job applications all across the country, even like all the way out in Alaska. I was just like, I need a job. And I was, sending out applications to all these different outlets, and I just wasn't getting a response. And I was I think the week I heard about the Hechinger job opening, I had pretty much decided that I was going to go back to school and maybe pursue a different sort of career path. I just didn't know I had sort of gotten to this point where I was like, is this maybe not the right career? I've been applying to all these places, not hearing back. And that week I heard from a former advisor. He was director of our student media at the university, and he'd since retired, and he reached out to me and said, hey, I have a job opportunity for you. I'm not sure if it's the right fit, because I know it's not maybe something you want to do, but it might help you get your foot in the door. And he said he had a former student who was now working at the Hechinger Report, and he said it's this news outlet that covers education. And I was just like, I was really interested. I'd always wanted to cover political affairs and foreign policy and sort of politics in general, and had no idea how to write about education stories. The only time I'd covered education was when I was covering higher ed and at ECU. And I was just like, okay. And he was like, and I'll give you a warning. It's not a reporter position. It's a social media producer. And so it was like completely something that I had not trained for, not something I was interested in. I wouldn't be reporting or writing, but he was like, it could help you get your foot in the door. And so he connected me with this former student of his who, she's actually my supervisor now, Nicole Doba, who's our Hechinger's engagement editor. And she was like, I talked to her before, and she's like, this is a great opportunity sort of for you to get your foot in the door. You'll be helping us with our newsletters and managing our social media accounts. And so that was kind of I kind of ended up there, and I thankfully got the job. I, flew out to New York and in the middle of winter and interviewed for the position. And I was very excited, and I spoke about my student media experience and some of my volunteer experience that I'd had, and didn't have a lot to go on, but thankfully they, I guess they maybe saw potential or something, but they hired me for the position, and I was a social media producer for 2 years at Hechinger. And then I still manage all our social media accounts and do that. And so I kind of have a twofold job where I'm doing social media and reporting at the same time.
Gotcha. How have you evolved as a reporter?
I think going from a college journalist to a professional journalist was a very learning opportunity, especially sort of, I think, going back to reporting during COVID when everything was online and our reporting was online and we couldn't be on the ground doing reporting, which was most of my experience. I think that really helped me kind of to, okay, hey, we're online, we're on Zoom. How do I tell stories that are impactful, that help, that connect to people? And how do I connect to my sources? And how do I, find stories and tell stories in a way that's still interesting, and how do I report online. And so all of that, I think, really the last 2 years have really helped me grow as a reporter. I think I went from somebody who was kind of scared to write and report, like be a little bit more creative in my writing and still be able to. I'd always, I think, seen news as like it's just straightforward news. But one thing that Hechinger has really helped me grow and evolve sort of is how do I tell my stories in a way, how do I report in a way that's really interesting. We call it like the Hechinger way, and really like how do I tell long form stories that are impactful and interesting and like narrative reporting. I had no experience with that, and so that's something I think I've hopefully learned to do better, and I'm still learning. I'm still growing. I've only been, reporting at Hechinger for about a year now, so it's interesting experience.
Well, it's good to get the perspective of someone for whom this is also new and fresh, certainly. I am curious about, you mentioned how you're dressed when you do your stories. Has anyone responded positively to that?
There's been definitely, I mean, since I started covering the last, year or so, I've only done a few stories in person, a few reporting trips in person, but most of, I think one really stands out to me when I was a reporter in North Carolina. I think people, as soon as they would see me, I think they would be very surprised. And then I would not really respond to some of the surprise. And I think a lot of people would think that I was like timid or something when they first spoke to me. And then I would start reporting or I start asking questions, and they would open up, and it was like that all kind of fell away. And I think that's kind of, I take that to be a little, I guess, positive. I have spoken to other Muslim girls, younger girls, who think it's really interesting and really cool that just because the way they dress or the way they look, it doesn't stop them from going into this field. So I think most of my positive experience, maybe from my own communities, like they think it's cool that, just because you're wearing a hijab and an abaya, it's not going to stop you from sort of pursuing something you love.
You're relatively young. How do you view the issues that journalists are most frequently dealing with now on things like public distrust and the struggling business model? And you're at a nonprofit. How do you view those things?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I definitely, like you mentioned, I am in a nonprofit, and I think when I heard about nonprofit newsroom, I honestly didn't know that much about nonprofit news. And I'm so thankful that I'm kind of in nonprofit news. I have friends who've gotten laid off at like a moment's notice, and it's just kind of scary when you're going into that industry and you're in that industry to know that, there's so many of our colleagues who are getting laid off at some of the other outlets. And I think our editors and our team has done a really good job of making sure that no one's that we're still kind of safe, and we're, working and able to have jobs. And so I think the nonprofit news model is interesting, and I do believe there's a lot of growth there and there's a lot of future there. And so hopefully that's something that we get to continue doing. And the mistrust part, I think that kind of comes with our society is just so polarized. And I think that kind of comes, like, I think it falls on us as well to make sure that we tell stories accurately, and we build connections with communities that maybe are underserved or communities that don't positively get represented. I think as a Muslim reporter, that's still one thing I struggle with, because there's I think a lot of the Muslim community still struggles to get positively represented in the news media. And a lot of times when I'll have conversations with friends or community members, they still don't view American media as something that's honest or open to covering them accurately. And so that is a constant struggle that even I deal with. And I get questions from friends and community members who are like, you're part of the media. Why are you, like, you should be doing this, or you should be doing this, or why isn't the news covering this? And it's constantly a sort of a struggle for myself too. And I think that there's still a lot of room for, news media, American news media, to kind of grow and make sure that we build trust with communities that we've sort of misrepresented and miscovered in the past. And I think that it falls on not just reporters themselves, but I think it also falls on leaders of news organizations to make sure that we're hiring reporters that come from those communities, and that so that we can accurately cover those communities.
And the Hechinger Report certainly doing that with you. Do you have a long-term vision for what you'd like to do in your career?
I'd love to be a full, like, just tell stories and be a reporter. I'm hoping to tell, like, I don't know if that may be the future. I don't know if I'll stay an education reporter forever, but one thing I've learned being an education reporter is, while I didn't see myself to be an education reporter, I'm so glad I fell into this beat. And the things that I've learned is that, education is sort of at the center of everything, regardless of which story. You can pick up any beat, any story, and there is some education has a thread that runs through all of these other beats. And so I think education is one of the most, if not the most important beat at the moment right now. And so I would love to continue staying to be an education reporter and continue to tell stories of students across the country and kind of what's to come.
The intermix of politics and education certainly very much in the news these days.
Yes.
So the last question is, the podcast is called The Journalism Salute. We salute you and the other members of the Hechinger Report for their good work, and we ask you to pay it forward. Is there a journalist or journalism organization that you're not associated with that you would like to salute for their good work?
Yeah, I think so there's a lot of journalists that I love and adore, and their work, respect so much. But I think as a Muslim woman, I have to, give a shout out to a fellow Muslim journalist who has inspired me a lot, and somebody who I looked up to before I entered the field. And I remember talking to her several times. Ruwaida Abdulaziz is HuffPost. She covers Islamophobia and Muslim communities across the country. And she's done such an incredible job of telling these stories. And I think she's inspired so many young Muslim women to kind of go into this field and not take, sorry to say, crap from people, but it tells stories accurately and tells stories in a way that people connect with. And so I would love to salute her for inspiring me. And then one other news outlet I would love to, it's maybe not a mainstream outlet, but it's one outlet that I go to get stories that I don't see in American media. Middle East Eye, and they're an online nonprofit news outlet based out of the Middle East, but they cover news about what's going on in parts of the world where maybe we don't get to accurately report on. And so that's one, I think the work that they're doing is amazing and really important, especially for immigrants like myself who maybe don't get to see our stories, or especially most of the reporters are Muslim reporters or, reporters of color. And so I'd like to salute them too for the work that they've done.
Javeria, Salman, thank you for taking the time to join us. Best of luck in your future. We'll be keeping tabs.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter @JournalismPod, and you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.